It was a hot summer day in 1185 BC in the Syrian city of Ugarit. A scribe picked up a pen and began to write. In his letter, he described the enemy's ships approaching from the Mediterranean and the chaos erupting in the city. It was a plea for help against these impending dangers. However, this letter never reached its intended destination because Ugarit had already been completely destroyed before the letter could even be sent. We were completely unaware of such a distress call until archaeological excavations were conducted in northern Syria in the 20th century. This letter had been waiting to be discovered for a full 3,000 years. So what was the significance of the city of Ugarit? What was the underlying reason? Had it failed to keep pace with the times, or was it simply too popular a place, attracting too many enemies? The city of Ugarit was one of the wealthiest regions of the ancient world, and the reason was its geographical location. We can use the Ottoman Empire as an example. The Ottoman Empire's golden age began after the conquest of Istanbul. We can apply this analogy to Ugarit. But was Ugarit the only place to suffer destruction? Definitely not. Between 1200 and 1150 BCE, all civilizations in the eastern Mediterranean suffered significant damage. Even Egypt suffered significant damage. So what was the real cause of all this destruction? Was it a punishment from God, or had some unknown ancient force brought this region to this state? This is where our story begins. To understand all of this, let's go back to the very beginning. Good evening, and welcome back to History for Sleep. I am an absolute history enthusiast, and I am just as fascinated by the blank spaces and the unsolved anomalies of our past as you are. Usually, we look at documented events, but tonight, we are stepping into one of those blank spaces, into a different kind of mystery. But before we go there, as always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Also, if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let your shoulders soften and your jaw unclench. Let your breathing slow down. Let your mind wander through the mysterious corridors of history. Let's begin. To understand the impact the collapse of the Bronze Age had on the ancient world, we must first understand the causes of this collapse and its consequences. But first, we need to look at what archaeologists were searching for and what they found. When archaeologists began excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries, they set out expecting to uncover the laws and wars between various states. However, what they found truly surprised them. While they had expected to uncover evidence of states that had fought each other a few times, what they discovered were findings of states interconnected in many ways. A world of trade routes, diplomatic correspondence, royal marriages, and shared technologies. You didn't expect that, did you? And yes, they had created an environment that was more peaceful and harmonious than our own. By the end of the Bronze Age, the balance of power had shifted somewhat. The Eastern Mediterranean was in the hands of a handful of powers. So who were these powerful nations? The most prominent and powerful was Egypt. During the New Kingdom period, Egypt had a population of approximately 3 million, an exceptionally large number for that time. They also kept meticulous records to guide future generations. Another major power was the Hittites. They controlled part of what is now Turkey and a large portion of Syria. They were a kingdom that could be considered a threat to Egypt. Not long after, a war broke out in 1274 BCE, and Egypt had truly been brought to a standstill. Subsequently, they ended the war by signing the Treaty of Kadesh, the first peace treaty in history. This treaty document is still preserved and is currently on display at the Museum of Ancient Oriental Art within the Istanbul Archaeology Museums. If you ever visit Istanbul, I highly recommend taking a look. The Hittites controlled the western region, while the Mycenaeans controlled the rest. Their sphere of influence extended from the palace centers at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Athens, encompassing the Greek mainland and most of the Aegean islands. This made them another powerful community in the region. They also had a vast trade network. They had established an extensive trade network with Egypt, the Levant, and Cyprus. They had established an extensive trade network with Egypt, the Levant, and Cyprus. Pottery and artifacts found in Turkey and Italy support this trade network. However, the best market was located in the kingdom of Ugarit on the Syrian coast. The city of Ugarit brought together merchants from Egypt, Canaan, Cyprus, and the Aegean, serving as a buffer zone. We can understand the richness of the culture here by noting that tablets written in 7 different languages were found among the artifacts. One of these alphabets is considered the ancestor of one of today's alphabets. There is no better example of this entire system than a ship that sank off the Turkish coast around 1300 BCE and remained undiscovered until 1982, when it was found near Uluburan Point by a Turkish sponge diver named Mehmet Kekir. If you ask me, the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century is the Uluburan wreck. Seymo Pulak, a Turkish researcher at the Institute of Marine Archaeology in Texas, spent a full 10 years studying the Uluburan wreck, and the things he discovered are truly unique. Bronze was the most important alloy of the age. In fact, that's where its name comes from. This shipwreck found off the coast of Turkey was carrying 10 tons of copper ingots and 1 ton of tin ingots from Central Asia. That was truly a massive amount. I'm sure the ship's owners faced a major crisis when it sank. Let's delve into the details of bronze's importance. By 1300 BCE, bronze was essentially the world's industrial metal. The primary material for many weapons, tools, and armor was copper. In fact, without access to these materials, forming a state or a community became nearly impossible. So how was bronze produced? 2 materials are needed to produce bronze. Without copper and tin, bronze could not be produced. These 2 materials were not found in the same places, leading to lengthy and costly trade agreements. So if this trade were interrupted even briefly, the entire system would be at risk. However, the sunken ship didn't just carry copper and tin. It also contained approximately 1 ton of terebinth resin. So what was it used for? This plant was widely used in perfume production at the time, but that wasn't all the ship carried. There was ebony from Africa and ivory obtained from elephants and hippopotamuses. Additionally, there were Egyptian gold jewelry and scarabs, as well as a gold ring likely belonging to a woman of royal lineage. and there were glass items of various colors. While glass is not particularly difficult to obtain today, it was very difficult to produce back then. Furthermore, there were numerous weapons from the Aegean and the Levant. Writing in the International Journal of Nautical Archaeology in 1997, Poulack described the Aluburan ship as representing a microcosm of late Bronze Age international trade. And he was right, because the objects in that single wreck had come from at least 10 different cultures, from as far away as the Baltic Sea in the north, and sub-Saharan Africa in the south, and Central Asia in the east, and the Western Mediterranean in the west. And they were all on one ship, heading somewhere in the Aegean around 1300 BC. And that ship is not unusual. It is just the one that survived. Because this is what the late Bronze Age actually looked like. It was not a collection of isolated ancient kingdoms. It was a globalized economy, and the kingdoms that made it up were deeply dependent on each other in ways that made them both wealthy and vulnerable at the same time. We know this not just from shipwrecks, but from letters, and the letters are extraordinary. In the 1880s, archaeologists excavating the site of the ancient Egyptian capital of Amarna found a cache of clay tablets that had been sent to the pharaoh from rulers all over the ancient Near East in the 14th century BC. And these letters are still called the Amarna letters, and they show a world of intense diplomatic activity in which the great kings addressed each other as brothers and sent each other gifts and daughters and complained when the gifts were not generous enough. The king of Babylon wrote to Amenhotep III of Egypt to complain that Egypt had sent gold statues filled with wood instead of solid gold. The king of Mitanni wrote to the pharaoh asking for gold, because he said gold is like dust in your land. The Hittite king and the Egyptian pharaoh exchanged letters about the treatment of ambassadors and the proper protocol for royal marriages. And all of this correspondence went back and forth by messenger across hundreds of miles of desert and mountain and sea. And it worked because there was a shared diplomatic culture that all the great powers participated in. But here is something worth knowing about this system, because it was not as stable as it looked from the outside, because the entire late Bronze Age economy depended on the continuous flow of raw materials from places that had them to places that needed them. And copper had to come from Cyprus, and tin had to come from Central Asia, and gold had to come from Egypt, and grain had to come from places that grew it. And if any part of that supply chain broke down, the effects rippled outward in ways that were very difficult to predict or manage. There is a comparison here that is worth making, because the late Bronze Age economy was not entirely unlike the global economy of today, where a disruption in a semiconductor factory in Taiwan or a blockage in the Suez Canal can affect industries on the other side of the world within weeks. And in 1300 BC, the supply chains were longer and slower, and there were no emergency reserves and no international monetary fund, and no way to quickly substitute one source of material for another, and the whole system was therefore running with very little margin for error. The Mycenaean palace at Pylos in southwestern Greece kept detailed records on clay tablets in a script called Linear B, and those records show how closely the palace monitored its resources and its obligations, because the tablets record everything from the number of rowers assigned to ships to the quantities of grain stored in various locations, to the amounts of bronze that had been distributed to smiths for working. And the picture that emerges from those tablets is of a highly organized palace economy that was also a very tightly wound one, where everything depended on everything else, and there was not much slack in the system. The Hittite great king Hattusili III wrote a letter to the king of Ugarit around 1250 BC that has been found in the Ugarit archive. And in this letter, Hattusili describes himself as the brother of the king of Ugarit and asks for a shipment of grain, because Hattusili says it is a matter of life and death for his land, and this is the most powerful king in Anatolia asking a trading city for grain. And it tells you something important about how interconnected and how mutually dependent these kingdoms were. And it also tells you something important about what happened when the droughts came, because the droughts did come, and when they came, they did not come gently. The biggest problem at the end of the Bronze Age wasn't war. You probably thought so, but no, it wasn't war. The problem was grain. Isn't that interesting? Around 1250 BC, the Hittite great king Tuttaliya IV sent a letter to the kingdom of Ugarit. We learn about this letter from the vast archives of the Ugarit kingdom that have survived to this day. In the letter, the king wrote not like the greatest emperor of the East, but like a helpless man. He doesn't mention impending great wars or some made-up tribe that never existed. What he speaks of is food. Yes, even a structure as grand as a bronze vessel can be brought to its knees by a shortage, no matter how powerful you may be. Perhaps that is why there was a more peaceful environment compared to today, because every state depended on every other state. In the letter, the emperor mentions that previous shipments have arrived and that his people genuinely need grain. We obtained this information from an article written by Trevor Bryce in the Cuneiform Studies Journal in 2000, and the University of Queensland supported this article. The bad news is that the Hittites didn't write these letters just once. They wrote them repeatedly, which means the situation was that dire. Sources from the same period also indicate that the Hittite people, due to food shortages, were making emergency grain imports from Egypt. In another Hittite letter, the Hittites explained the importance of this matter to the pharaoh and say the following: "This is a matter of life and death for my country. These are the words of a kingdom in dire straits." The Hittite capital at Hattusa, which had stood for 5 centuries, was evacuated around 1180 BC and was never reoccupied, and there is no record of a great battle or a final defeat, only silence and empty granaries. Ugarit was sending grain to the Hittites, and Ugarit's own supplies were running low. In the Ugarit archives from the city's final decades, there is a letter written by the king of Ugarit to the pharaoh of Egypt. The letter describes a famine so severe that people in his kingdom were beginning to fade away, and it requests an urgent grain shipment, and then states that he cannot convey all this suffering in a single tablet. The letter was found undelivered among the ruins of Ugarit 3,000 years after it was written, which means the grain either never arrived or arrived far too late, and the Egyptian king never replied. Now, let's get to the main question. Normally, there were no issues with this grain trade. It was sufficient for the region, so what happened to cause this region to end up in this state? Why had the farms in this area stopped producing? If you think we'll find the answer on clay tablets, you're mistaken. The answer came in 1990 from Paul Sabatier University in Toulouse, France. French archaeologist David Kanievsky, along with his colleagues, conducted a study and collected samples from lake beds in the eastern Mediterranean. Of course, they took samples from lakes that had been preserved from that time until now. What Kanievsky discovered helped shed light on changes in vegetation around 1200 BCE. Situation in the region was clear. Tree pollen had decreased significantly. Drought-tolerant grasses had spread widely, and pollen associated with agriculture had completely disappeared. Kanievsky published his findings in the journal PLOS 1 and identified an extraordinarily severe regional drought that lasted several decades. To support this view, the same pattern was observed in cores taken from Greece, the Levant, and Anatolia. Thus, the theory Kanievsky proposed was substantiated, because a drought lasting decades is not just a bad harvest, it spans a generation. A child born just as the rains first began to fail would have grown into an adult who had never seen a reliable harvest. And farmers who had grown up contributing surplus grain to the palace granaries would have nothing left to give, so they would be unable to provide for anyone. The Hittite city of Imar, which still stands in northern Syria today, contains evidence illustrating the severity of the situation on the ground. Sources tell us that grain prices suddenly rose 30 to 40 times, and that the people suffered greatly. In fact, the sources record that families sold themselves into debt servitude just to obtain food. And state institutions that had existed for centuries brought their activities to a standstill due to this situation. Imar, however, could not withstand this famine in 1185 BCE and was destroyed, never to be rebuilt. But was that the only cause? Yes, it would make sense for a state to collapse due to drought back then, but the field tells us there's more to it. Geological studies are also investigating this issue. Amos Nur, a geophysicist at Stanford University, began his research in the 1990s. He conducted studies on the ground in various areas of the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. He discovered something unusual in the layers. These unusual layers dated back to the period between 1225 and 1175 BCE, and some of them showed physical traces that Nur, based on his training, recognized as evidence of seismic activity. The most compelling evidence supporting this view was that the houses from that period had collapsed outward rather than inward, and the cracks in the foundations of the houses. All of these factors were interconnected, proving that this was not the result of human intervention. These houses had collapsed in a manner consistent with an earthquake. Nur called this an earthquake storm, and he published his findings in his 2008 book, Apocalypse, written with science journalist Dawn Burgess. And the sites he documented included Tyrans and Mycenae in Greece, and sites across Cyprus and the Levant. And he argued that a series of major earthquakes had moved through the region over several decades. And Brandon Drake of the University of New Mexico, writing in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2012, challenged Nur's interpretation and argued that the climate data alone could account for most of the destruction. But Drake did not dismiss the earthquakes entirely. He simply argued that they were one factor among several. And there was another factor that historians have argued about for decades, which is the question of whether some of these palace societies collapsed, partly from within. Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University argued in a 2011 paper in the Journal of World Prehistory that the Canaanite city-states in the southern Levant were already showing signs of internal stress before any invaders arrived, and that the evidence from settlement patterns and from the distribution of pottery styles suggested that populations were moving out of the cities and into the countryside before the destructions. And Finkelstein argued that external attackers arrived in a landscape that was already coming apart from drought and famine and internal social pressure, rather than a landscape that was stable and flourishing. The palace at Pylos in southwestern Greece provides the most extraordinary window into what all of this felt like from inside. The Pylos Palace was destroyed by fire around 1180 BC, and the fire baked the clay tablets in the palace archive hard enough to preserve them for 3,000 years, and the linear B script on those tablets was deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris, a young English architect who had become obsessed with the script as a teenager and had been working on it as a hobby for years alongside his career designing buildings. And when scholars read the Pylos archive, they found something remarkable. The tablets from the final weeks of the Pylos Palace show rowers being assigned to ships and deployed to coastal watch positions to look for threats from the sea, and they show bronze being stripped from the religious sanctuaries of the palace and redistributed to smiths to be made into weapons, and they show women and children being moved to inland locations away from the coast, and soldiers being redeployed from their normal assignments to defensive watch points along the shoreline. Writing in the Cambridge Companion to the Aegean Bronze Age in 2008, John Bennett of the University of Oxford described the Pylos archive as one of the most vivid administrative records ever recovered, of a society mobilizing a systematic response to imminent catastrophe. And what makes it extraordinary, says Bennett, is not panic and disorder, but precision and organization. The palace bureaucracy was functioning correctly right up until the moment it stopped functioning forever, and Pylos was destroyed and never rebuilt. And back in Ugarit, there is a letter that has no parallel anywhere in the ancient record. The letter was found sealed in a pottery jar in the ruins of Ugarit, and it was written by an official named Eshuwara, who was the senior governor of Elashia, the ancient kingdom on Cyprus, and the letter was addressed to the king of Ugarit. And it said, "The enemy ships are here, they have been setting fire to my villages, and they have done evil things in my country." And the letter asked for soldiers and for ships. And the king of Ugarit did not answer, because Ugarit was already burning. And there is one more letter from the Ugarit archive, written in what scholars believe were the final days before the city fell. And it says, "When your messenger arrived, the army was already humiliated, and the city was sacked. Our food in the threshing floors was burnt, and the vineyards were also destroyed. Our city is sacked. May you know it. May you know it." And that phrase, repeated twice, has stayed with historians who study this period for generations, because it is a man in a burning city writing on a clay tablet and asking only that someone somewhere will know what happened. And the letter was never sent, and the city was never rebuilt. Eric Klein of George Washington University wrote the most comprehensive modern account of the collapse in his 2014 book 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, and in a 2015 lecture at the National Geographic Society in Washington, D.C., he described what he found as a perfect storm. And in that lecture, Klein said this: "If you look at all of these events individually, drought, famine, invaders, earthquakes, maybe disease, any single one of them is probably not enough to bring down an entire civilization, let alone 8 or more. But when you combine them all at the same time, in societies that were already highly stressed and dependent on each other, then you get a systemic collapse. And that is what the evidence shows." And that brings us to the Sea Peoples, because the Sea Peoples were real, and they did attack, and they did destroy cities. And Ramses III fought them in 1177 BC in a battle he described as one of the greatest crises in the history of Egypt. And the carvings he made of that battle at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu in Thebes are still standing today. And the question that has never been fully answered is who exactly the Sea Peoples were, and where they had come from, and why they were moving in such large numbers, with women and children in ox carts rolling alongside the armies. In the 8th year of his reign, Ramses III looked out from his palace at Medinet Habu in Thebes. Perhaps this was the last time he gazed peacefully upon his empire. The news that led him to this thought had come from the north. Every day, worse news arrived from the north. Reports described a group advancing southward through Anatolia and the Levant, bringing suffering wherever it went. The reports referred to this group as the Confederation of Peoples. The Hittites, the pride of the north, had been utterly destroyed by this force. They hadn't even bothered to try to destroy the kingdom of Ugarit. The wind they brought was enough to bring it down. As for the Canaanite cities, the situation was far from promising. The Confederation's new target was Egypt, the sole remaining major power. The day had come for Ramses III to prove he was greater than the others, but there were no others left to compare himself to. A great war took place in 1177 BCE. The Medinet Habu inscription describes the Confederation of Peoples during that period. It specifically mentions 5 groups: the Peliset, the Jeker, the Shekelesh, the Denan, and the Weshesh. The inscription also states that they were completely unable to fight against the weapons of this confederation. It also mentions the Hittite Empire, the kingdom of Arzawa, the city of Carchemish, and the lands of Alatia, Cyprus. All of them, one after another, before reaching the Egyptian borders. The scale of the events described in the inscription is extraordinary, because a single coalition wiped out an entire civilization and continued its advance southward. However, this raises another issue. Ramses III was certainly not an honest man. He engaged in self-promotion on numerous occasions and continued to do so for a long time. In fact, many pharaohs did this. They had ordinary events portrayed heroically in their records, making themselves appear as heroes. It had even become a tradition. Some scholars argue that the Medinet Habu inscription is a complete fabrication, claiming that during a time when Egypt was plagued by poor policies, drought, and internal collapse, the pharaohs refused to take the blame and instead invented a Sea Peoples tribe to shift the blame onto them. Is this a strong claim? I think it's definitely very strong. Let's examine together where the name Sea Peoples comes from. Of course, such a name was not used in antiquity. The term was coined by the French Egyptologist Emmanuel de Rougy. He examined the Medinet Habu texts in 1855 and gave this name to the group. And ever since then, historians have used this name. Grouping these diverse peoples into a single category is not an ancient reality, but a modern scientific convenience. So who exactly was this group referred to as the Sea Peoples? The Palisad are the most confidently identified of the groups named at Medinet Habu, because after the battles with Ramses III, the Palisad settled in the coastal cities of the southern Levant, at places like Ashdod and Akron and Gath, and they became the people that the Hebrew Bible calls the Philistines. And the Philistines gave their name to the region, and the region eventually gave its name to Palestine, and that is a direct and traceable line from the chaos of 1177 BC to a geographical name that is still in use today. And it is one of the few firm identifications we can make among all the Sea Peoples groups. The Shurden are another group that appears in Egyptian sources, and they are interesting because they show up not just as enemies of Egypt, but as mercenaries in the Egyptian army. And reliefs at Medinet Habu show Shurden warriors fighting alongside Egyptian troops against other Sea Peoples. And the Shurden are often connected by scholars to Sardinia, because the name Shurden sounds like Sardinia. And because Bronze Age Nuragic culture in Sardinia shows some similarities to the material culture associated with the Sea Peoples in the Levant. But this identification is not universally accepted, and Robert Drews of Vanderbilt University, writing in his 1993 book The End of the Bronze Age, argued that the connections between the Shurden and Sardinia are suggestive, but not conclusive. The origins of the Sea Peoples more broadly have been debated for a century and a half, and no consensus has emerged. And that is the honest answer, and the theories fall into roughly two camps. The first camp argues that the Sea Peoples were primarily refugees from the collapse of Mycenaean Greece, and that as the Mycenaean palaces fell in the late 13th century BC, populations of Mycenaean Greeks and other Aegean peoples were set in motion and moved east and south looking for new places to settle. And this theory was developed most fully by the archaeologist Anne Killebrew of Penn State University and her colleague Gunnar Lehmann of the University of Beersheba, writing in the 2013 volume The Philistines and Other Sea Peoples in Text and Archaeology. And it is supported by the fact that early Philistine pottery found at sites like Ashdod and Ashkelon is very similar to late Mycenaean pottery styles. The second camp argues that the Sea Peoples were a more diverse and heterogeneous group, drawn from multiple regions including Anatolia and the Aegean and Cyprus, and possibly even the Western Mediterranean, and that they were not primarily refugees from Mycenaean collapse, but were a mixture of displaced populations set in motion by the broader climate crisis and political instability of the period. And Eric Klein of George Washington University, writing in his 2014 book 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, argued for this more complex picture, and pointed out that the ox carts carrying women and children that appear in the Medinet Habu reliefs are not the equipment of an invading army. They are the equipment of people who have packed up everything they own and are moving because they have nowhere left to go. And that image of the ox carts is one of the details that changes how you think about the sea peoples entirely. Because the Medinet Habu reliefs at Thebes, which were carved under the supervision of Ramses III himself, show not just warriors advancing on Egypt. They show entire families in motion, women and children riding in ox carts pulled by teams of oxen, with all their possessions loaded alongside them, and the carts are rolling through the battle scenes alongside the fighting men. And the Egyptian artist who carved those scenes was not making propaganda. He was recording something he had actually seen, which was a people in migration, not just an army on campaign. And this is a crucial distinction, because an army on campaign goes home after the fighting, and a people in migration does not have a home to go back to. The archaeologist Eserna Killebrew has argued that the sea peoples were a migration event, not a military invasion in the traditional sense, and that what Egypt was facing in 1177 BC was the leading edge of a population movement driven by the same combination of drought and famine and political collapse that was destroying the palace societies of the eastern Mediterranean, and that Ramses III, by defeating the sea peoples militarily, could not actually stop the migration. He just prevented it from overrunning Egypt and redirected it toward the less defended coastline of Canaan, where the Philistines and other groups eventually settled. Egypt survived, but it was changed by the experience, and the Egypt that came out of the battles with the sea peoples was weaker and smaller than the Egypt that had gone in, and Ramses III was the last great pharaoh of the new kingdom, and after his passing in 1155 BC, Egypt entered a period of slow decline, and the territory it had controlled in Canaan and the Levant gradually slipped away, and the empire that had been built by Thutmose III and Ramesses II contracted, and the administrative system that had maintained it began to fall apart. Writing in the Oxford History of Ancient EGYPT in 2000, Ian Shaw of the University of Liverpool described the reign of Ramses III as a last flourish of new kingdom power before a long decline, and Shaw noted that even in the inscriptions celebrating his victories against the sea peoples, there are signs of strain in the Egyptian state, because the Papyrus Harris, which was compiled after the passing of Ramses III and is the longest surviving papyrus from ancient Egypt, lists the enormous donations that Ramesses made to the temples of Egypt and suggests a king who was trying to maintain divine favor through generosity at a moment when the state was under pressure. The Battle of 1177 BC was not the end of the Sea People's story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, because the groups that had been deflected from Egypt moved into the Levant and settled there, and the archaeological record shows new pottery styles and new burial practices, and new architectural forms appearing at sites along the Canaanite coast in the 12th century BC. And these are the traces of the Philistines and the other Sea Peoples groups, establishing themselves in a landscape that had been reshaped by a generation of drought and war and collapse. And the question of where the Sea Peoples came from before they arrived in the eastern Mediterranean in such numbers is one that scholars are still arguing about. And new evidence keeps appearing, because in 2019 a team led by Leonid Yadrin and including researchers from several European universities, published a genetic study of traces from the ancient population from the Philistine city of Ashkelon in Israel, and the results were published in the journal Nature Communications. And they showed that the early Philistine population at Ashkelon had significant genetic ancestry from southern Europe, consistent with an origin in the Aegean or the western Mediterranean. And this was the first direct genetic evidence bearing on the origins of any sea peoples group. And it supported the theory of an Aegean origin for at least the Peleset. But it did not resolve the question entirely, because the genetic signal from southern Europe faded in later generations as the Philistines mixed with the local Canaanite population. And so the sea peoples remain what they have always been, a partial answer to a question that has never been fully resolved. And the Bronze Age collapse remains what it has always been, one of the most dramatic and least understood events in the history of human civilization. And that is where we will leave it tonight, with the ox carts rolling and the cities burning and the letters going unanswered, and the tablets waiting in the ground for 3,000 years until someone came along to read them. The Bronze Age collapse did not end cleanly. There was no treaty signed and no moment when someone declared that the old world was over and a new one had begun. Instead, the collapse happened slowly and unevenly over several decades. And when the dust settled around 1100 BC, the eastern Mediterranean looked almost unrecognizable compared to what it had been a century earlier. The Hittite Empire was gone, completely vanished from history, and would not be rediscovered by modern scholars until a German archaeologist named Hugo Winkler excavated the ruins of Hattusa in central Turkey between 1906 and 1912, and found the royal archive buried in the ground, and realized what he was looking at. And for 3,000 years, the Hittites had been forgotten so thoroughly that the Bible mentioned them as a minor people, and nobody knew that they had once been one of the great powers of the ancient world. Mycenaean Greece collapsed, and the palace culture that had produced the Linear B script and the great citadels at Mycene and Tiryns and Pylos disappeared, and Greece entered what historians call the Dark Ages, a period of several centuries during which population declined and long-distance trade nearly stopped, and writing disappeared entirely from the Greek world. And when writing came back, it was a completely different script based on the Phoenician alphabet, and the memory of the Mycenaean world survived only an oral tradition passed down through generations of storytellers and eventually written down as the Iliad and the Odyssey. And Ugarit, the great trading city on the Syrian coast, was never rebuilt, and the site where it stood was abandoned for centuries and is now a mound in northern Syria called Ras Shamra. And when a French archaeologist named Claude Scheffer began excavating it in 1929, he found the city exactly as it had been left the day it burned. The jars of olive oil still in the storehouses, the tablets still in the archive rooms, the jewelry of the wealthy families still in their houses. And it has been called one of the best preserved destruction sites in the ancient world, because nobody ever came back to clean it up or reuse the materials. But here is something worth knowing about what came after, because the Bronze Age collapse was not only destruction, it was also transformation. The disruption of the Bronze Age trade networks, which had depended on long-distance supply chains for copper and tin, forced the peoples of the eastern Mediterranean to find new materials to work with, and the material they turned to was iron, and iron ore was available locally in many places where copper and tin were not, and the technology for working iron had existed for centuries, but had never been widely used because bronze was superior in many ways, and there was no incentive to switch as long as the bronze trade kept functioning. And when the bronze trade collapsed, the incentive to develop iron working suddenly became very powerful, and within a few generations, iron tools and weapons were widespread across the eastern Mediterranean, and the Iron Age had begun. And the Phoenician traders of the Levantine coast, who had survived the collapse better than most of their neighbors, because their cities were smaller and more flexible and less dependent on palace economies, began spreading their alphabetic writing system across the Mediterranean as their trade networks expanded. And that alphabet reached Greece and was adapted into the Greek alphabet. And from Greek it eventually became the Latin alphabet. And the alphabet you are using to read these words is a direct descendant of the writing system that Phoenician merchants were using to keep their accounts in the centuries after the Bronze Age collapse. Eric Klein of George Washington University, who has spent his career studying this period, argued in his 2014 book, 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, that the Bronze Age collapse is worth understanding not just as ancient history, but as a case study in how complex interconnected systems can fail. And Klein has pointed out in multiple lectures and interviews that the late Bronze Age world faced a combination of climate stress and disrupted trade and migration and internal social pressure that is not entirely unlike the combination of stresses that the modern world is navigating. And he is careful to say he is not predicting a modern collapse, but he argues that the Bronze Age example shows how quickly systems that appear stable can unravel when multiple stressors hit at the same time. And then there is the question of who the Sea Peoples actually were, because some of them we can identify with reasonable confidence. And the Peliset, who appear in the Medinet Habu inscriptions of Ramses III, are almost certainly the people who settled in the southern Levant after the Egyptian battles and became the Philistines. And the Philistines gave their name to the region, and the region gave its name to Palestine, and that is a direct line from the chaos of 1177 BC to a name that is still in the news today. And the other groups remain mysteries. The Jeker and the Shekelesh and the Denayan and the Weshesh appear in the Egyptian inscriptions and then disappear from the record. And scholars have proposed connections to Sardinia and Sicily and the Aegean and Anatolia, and none of these identifications is certain. And the honest answer is that we do not know exactly who most of the Sea Peoples were or where they came from, and that mystery has been with us for 150 years, and it shows no sign of being resolved. What we do know is that the Bronze Age collapse was one of the most significant events in the history of human civilization, and that the world that came after it, the Iron Age world of Phoenician traders and Greek city-states, and the rise of new empires was built on the ruins of what had been there before, and that the letters and tablets that survive the fires of Ugarit and Pylos have given us a window into a world that was lost and that is still not fully understood. If you enjoyed drifting through this story tonight, please go ahead and subscribe to History for Sleep and leave a comment below telling us which mystery from the ancient world you would most like to explore next. And if you know someone who likes falling asleep to forgotten history, please share this with them. We will be back soon with another story that deserves to be remembered.